Hello, everyone. As you may know, I'm David Clary, President of Magdalen College, and I'd like to welcome you to this Magdalen webinar. It's a quite exciting event for us. And this is a very special title today. It's Our Social World, the Most Complex Thing in the Universe. And we have two of our very distinguished fellows who will be talking today. Robin Dunbar will discuss the positive side of relationships, and Lucy Bowes will discuss the dark side of relationships. Lucy is our tutorial fellow in experimental psychology at Magdalen. She was an undergraduate at Oxford and graduating in 2004. She got a PhD in behavioral genetics in 2011 from the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London. And she was a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the Department of Experimental Psychology in Oxford and was appointed as a Fellow here at Magdalen in 2014. Her research focuses on the impact of early life stress on psychological and behavioral development. And in particular, Lucy has focused on the effects of victimisation on young people's adjustment and well-being. And the aim of her research is to guide intervention work by identifying protective factors that promote positive outcomes amongst vulnerable children. And our other speaker is Robin Dunbar. Robin was an undergraduate at Magdalen in the difficult subject philosophy and psychology and graduated in 1969. He got his PhD at Bristol University and held academic posts at Cambridge, UCL and Liverpool, and then came back to Oxford and Magdalen in 2007 to take up the post of Director of the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology. In 1998, Robin was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and 2015 was awarded the Huxley Medal, the top medal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. He is best known for formulating Dunbar's number, a measurement of the cognitive limit to the number of individuals with whom any one person can maintain stable relationships. And Robin is going to talk first, and then Lucy will follow, and then there's the opportunity for questions and answer. On the screen, you can type in questions to the speakers via the Q&A facility, and then they will answer your questions after they have spoken. So I'm now going to hand over to Robin Dunbar.
Well, good evening, everybody. Great pleasure to talk to you all here. I'm actually going to talk, I suppose, about something which is very mundane. That's the social world we live in and that we're very familiar with, because that's sort of 90% of what our brain spends its time doing, probably. We're just one of the monkeys and apes as a generic family, if you like. And like all the monkeys and apes, we're very intensely social, and our whole kind of evolutionary strategy has been built around that sociality. We have very different kinds of groups to the other species of mammals and birds. So we have these bonded groups in which essentially individuals get together and create what's really an implicit social contract to solve the problems of survival and successful reproduction. And particularly the groups form to buffer you against the threats that come in from outside, predators primarily as much as anything. But the problem with living in social groups of this kind, these kind of stable bonded social groups, is they create enormous stresses, as I'm sure we're all terribly familiar with, from living in lockdown now in confined spaces with small numbers of people. Those stresses scale up enormously when we live in large groups. And so the only way primates have been able to maintain these relatively large bonded social groups has been to find some buffer against those stresses. And those buffers really come down to friendship. So the kind of social world we live in is one in which we're trying to maintain a large group of many, perhaps in our case, several hundred individuals as a buffer against the threats, the external threats, and then a small little cohort of friends who buffer us against the stresses of living in these large groups. And I think one of the astonishing things really from the last 15 years at most has been a positive tsunami really of studies showing that the single most important factor affecting all sorts of aspects of your mental and physical health is simply the number of friends you have. The number of friends you have is the best predictor of how happy you are, whether you're depressed or not, your general well-being, your sense of life satisfaction, how engaged you are with your local community, how much you trust the other members of your local community. It affects your illness rates. It even affects your chances of dying in the future, as it were, whether that's likely to happen sooner or later. So these sort of proximate benefits, as it were, are really quite enormous because, it literally is the number of close friends that you have that really determine that. And we've had a look at that in a number of large-scale national surveys across England and Wales and Scotland. And these are very, very striking effects. So the problem here is really that these friendships that we have are extremely cognitively demanding. So trying to juggle these two levels of society, if you like, the outer group, the community that you live within, as well as your sort of close group of friends and family, is extremely demanding, and really only primates are able to do that. There are two real, well, I suppose one might ask whether having the more friends you can have, the better. And the answer in principle, of course, is yes. But in fact, there's a limit on the number of close friends that you can maintain, indeed, therefore, on the total size of the group you can live within. And that's a consequence of these costs of maintaining friendships, essentially. Now, it turns out that there are two principal costs. One comes in terms of sheer brain power. So this is bounced off what's become known as the social brain hypothesis, which is the relationship between social group size in monkeys and apes, right the way across all the monkeys and apes, and the size of their brains, and in particular the size of the neocortex, which is the kind of outer part of the brain, the newer part of the mammalian brain, which has expanded out of all proportion in monkeys and apes compared to other mammals. And of course, our neocortex is by far the biggest of any of these species, which is why we live in much, much bigger groups. Now, part of the problem here is it's not just a memory problem. You can remember many more than 150 or so faces and put names to them and know something about them. It seems that the limit on the number of faces, let's say, you can put names to is at about 1,500. But you can't get close to that in terms of maintaining a coherent social group. So your social network turns out to be about 150 people. That's the number that's now known as Dunbar's number. And that's the number we actually predicted off the back of the size of our network plugged in, brain size plugged into this relationship between social group size and brain size across the whole of the primate order. That in part seems to be a consequence of the fact that the cognitive skills that we need to handle relationships, which involve things like mentalizing, the ability to understand what somebody else is thinking, what their intentions are, how they might understand or misunderstand what you're saying, is actually very expensive in terms of neural processing time. So one of our neuroimaging experiments, we were able to show that when you're doing that kind of task, you're trying to think what somebody else is up to and why they're doing what they're doing and so on, trying to get inside their mind. It involves much more neural recruitment than if you're just trying to process factual, pure factual, physical world factual information at the same level. So there is this cognitive limit on the number of, or the size of our social networks, I guess it is. And then what seems to happen is scaled down within that limit is a series of layers of friendship of increasing quality and decreasing quantity until you get to this inner core layer of sort of 5 best friends, which I always refer to as the shoulders to cry on friends. They're the ones who are going to come to your aid no matter what, if you're in need. The other constraint on this is simply time. And this goes back to the way monkeys and apes create their friendships, build their relationships with each other, which is based on grooming. Now, it turns out that we have a very specialized neural system. Actually, all mammals share it, but it's very particularly important in primates and in humans, in that all it does is respond to light, slow stroking at a very specific speed, about 2.5 centimeters a second, which is the speed at which the hand slides over the fur during grooming. And what that does is trigger an endorphin response in the brain. Endorphins are part of the pain management system, essentially. They're opioids. They're very similar in their way we experience them to things like morphine. That's where the word endorphin comes from. It's a contraction of endogenous morphine, meaning the brain's own morphine, if you like. And it gives this kind of opiate high, but it makes us very relaxed, it makes us very trusting, takes the cares of the world off our shoulders. And we still do grooming. We've shown with neuroimaging experiments that being just lightly stroked on the torso produces this massive sort of endorphin hit in the brain, and the brain gets very excited. Now, the problem with grooming, as all primates, and indeed we will know, is that it's very limiting in the sense that its sheer intimacy, the physical intimacy of it, means that it really is a one-on-one thing. You can only groom one individual at a time. And if you don't believe me, I can only recommend that you try cuddling with 2 people in the back seat of the cinema. And I'll bet you that within 10 minutes at the very outside, one of them will have left in a bit of a grump because you've not been paying attention to them. Sort of grooming, that intimacy of grooming really requires sort of almost staring into the eyeballs of the other person. Right, and this is as true for monkeys as it is for us. So the problem that's created for monkeys is actually limited the size of the groups they can bond, and that limit is set as a result of the amount of time they have available for social interaction. It's set at about 50 individuals, whereas during the course of human evolution, as we try to increase our group sizes up to this magic number of 150, required us somehow to break through that kind of glass ceiling imposed by grooming. And the way we've done that, it seems, is to capitalize on a number of other behaviors which also turn out to be extremely good at triggering the endorphin system. The earliest of those to come in was laughter, something we share with the great apes. And then after that, during the course of later human evolution, what seems to have kicked in is singing and dancing, the rituals of religion, emotional storytelling, which is extremely good at triggering the endorphin system. We actually ran an experiment on that in the college's lecture theatre a few years ago. Social eating and drinking of alcohol. Alcohol turns out to be an extremely good trigger of the endorphin system. And in fact, that's partly what they treat you for at alcohol clinic, I am told. It is the addiction to the endorphins rather than the alcohol itself. It's in many ways the endorphins that you get addicted to. All of these things are extremely good at triggering the endorphin system. And what seems to be very important about them is that they're done socially. So we showed on a few years ago using the university rowing crews, the Blue Boat and the Second Boat teams, that doing an activity like rowing in synchrony ramps up the endorphin production that you would normally get from just doing the same activity alone. So there's something special about these activities and about the extent to which we do them socially. Now, just to sort of finish up, we'll mention perhaps one of the most important consequences of this, and that is simply the fact that friendships are very fragile. They're very dependent on how much time you invest in them. So each of these kind of layers of our social network requires a very specific amount of time devoted to a friend to keep them in that sort of level of intimacy to us. And the most expensive of the lot is this little core of 5 shoulders to cry on friends right at the center of our social world. Turns out that we have to invest, or we do invest, something in the order of 40% of our total social effort into those 5 individuals alone. And that's really to make sure that they will do the job we expect of them, which is to give us emotional and financial and social and other kinds of support when our world falls apart. And just how important that is, I think, is evident from the following thought experiment, if you like. I quite often invite people to just step out into the street, well, not now, but when we're no longer in lockdown, and rush up to the first stranger and throw your arms about them and ask them to give you a cuddle and a hug because your entire social world has fallen apart. Well, I'll bet you the immediate response you'll get is they'll get their phone out and phone the police or the ambulance or something, and they'll back off in a hurry. Now, do that to one of your 5 inner core shoulders to cry on friends, and of course they will respond very differently. They'll give you the emotional and other support that you really in desperate need of. So 40% of our time, and we spend about 3 hours a day, according to our estimates, in social interaction that doesn't involve work, let's say, social interaction with friends and family. We spend another 20% on the next 10 people out from our closest 5. So 60% of our total social effort is invested in just 15 people out of our 150. And the rest of them, I'm afraid, get about 30 seconds a day, particularly out on the outer edges. And the reason for this is that friendships are very, very susceptible to decay. We've found from one of our studies, and it's supported by data from other studies from elsewhere, that if you don't invest the requisite amount of time required for a person of that level of intimacy to you, that friendship will start to decay within a couple of months. And it probably takes only about 3 years for somebody to slide down the slippery slope from being a very good friend of yours to just being, well, somebody I once knew and that you might send a Christmas card to, perhaps, but that's it. So these things are very susceptible to time investment. They're very cognitively demanding for us, but they're the single most important thing in our world. And despite the fact that this social universe we live in is extraordinarily complex, really, it's the best thing that can happen to you. So I can only invite you, when you can get out of lockdown again, to rush around and invest heavily in your friendships. It's the best thing you can do. And at that point, I shall pass over to Lucy.
Thank you so much, Robin. I so enjoyed listening to that. I will do exactly that. And how can I follow up on grooming and drugs and addiction? So it's a pleasure to talk with you all today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the dark side of relationships, particularly in those teenage years. So friendships, clearly, as Robin told us so beautifully, are central to our well-being. And social relationships are particularly important during the teenage years, particularly peer relationships, so similar age peers. So developmental studies have looked at the social influence of other people. And younger children, as you might expect, are more influenced by their parents. But there's this period in adolescence where peer influence is really primary. And that can be for both better and for worse. And a lot of my research has actually focused on the worse, in particular on bullying. And just to flag up, so bullying, you know, we've all heard about it. We all think we know about it. But in a recent survey that we analysed data from, of over 114,000 15-year-olds in the UK, 30% reported that they'd experienced recent bullying. 30%, that was huge, it's shockingly huge. What do they mean by bullying? They mean different actions. We often think about physical violence when we use sort of everyday discussions of bullying. But it's not just physical violence. It can be name calling. Actually, that's often the most frequently cited type of bullying. It can be social exclusion. It can be having things stolen from you. There's been a lot of recent research on cyberbullying, so things happening online, rumours spread about you again, fake Facebook profiles set up and so on. I should highlight there that although cyberbullying is a growing concern, and we are all sort of watching it very carefully, in that survey I mentioned of the 30% of people who had experienced recent bullying, actually it was a very small minority who reported that they'd experienced cyberbullying. So that's some good news. Should we care? Is it important? Is it not just a rite of passage? I think, and I think researchers are beginning to realise just how much of an impact bullying may have on young people's mental health. So whereas perhaps 50 or so years ago, it really was considered as a normative rite of passage for young people to work out relationships, figure out social hierarchies, what analysis is showing time and time again is that there's what we would call a dose-response relationship. The more bullying you have experienced, the greater your likelihood of developing depression, not just as a child, but as an adult, anxiety, self-harm. You're more likely to leave school. You may also be more likely to kill yourself. So there is a link between bullying and suicide in the most extreme cases. And this is hugely concerning because what we have is a risk factor that's very, very common that seems to be having a detrimental impact. And you might think, well, you know, suicide, absolutely, that's extreme. But the link between bullying and mental health, surely that's only when bullying's really, really bad, only in, you know, the most extreme forms that one could imagine. But actually what we see is a pretty linear relationship. So we, you know, it may only be the case that a minority of individuals go on to develop a psychological disorder, but we're not, you know, the relationship we're seeing is that the more bullying you've experienced, the greater the likelihood. So why does bullying happen? Relationships are so important to us. Why is this happening time and time again? So studies have looked at the sort of the social rewards of bullying. Why do kids bully other kids? And what they found is that, or one of the theories, is that children may bully others to gain social dominance or to maintain social dominance. And where that is the case, it actually seems to be quite effective. So believe it or not, those kids who bully others are often more popular amongst their peers, and it can seem to cement their position in a social hierarchy, at least in certain school environments. We see things like in classes where you've got a stronger social hierarchy, you get a greater prevalence of bullying. Interestingly, in schools where there are difficulties between the governance and more arguments and conflict, it peters down and you see more prevalence of bullying amongst the kids at that school, which is pretty concerning. So there's some sort of structural level reasons why some may bully others, which are interesting. Bullying often happens in front of an audience. So when we think about the social gains of bullying, it's quite rare actually that a child will bully another without anyone else around. That's true all the way up into adulthood. It's more likely that there will be other people there to witness the bullying. And we're starting to understand more and more about what an important role these active bystanders play in bullying behaviours by not signalling that they find this disagreeable or by not stepping up or stepping in. The impact of bullying on a young person may actually be worse. So being bullied may actually feel worse. So there's some interesting social dynamics around bullying. But a lot of my research is focused on, well, who gets bullied? So if this is to do with social dominance, gaining social status, who are the children who are most likely to be bullied? Well, the results show that there are a whole broad range of interconnected variables that might predict one's risk of being bullied. From the neighbourhood you live in, if you live in a neighbourhood characterised by more violence and crime, you're more likely to be targeted by bullies at school. In your family, if you've been exposed to child abuse, you're twice as likely to be bullied at school than a child who hasn't had that experience at home. All the way down to the individual level. And at the individual level, those children, as you might guess, with low self-esteem, higher symptoms of depression, of anxiety in the first place, are more likely to be targeted. Perhaps they find it more difficult to defend themselves. Also, children who are less well liked by their peers, so they're less likely to have that social group step in and protect them. They are at greater risk of bullying. And studies have shown that teachers can play a role in this, because if these children are experiencing difficulties, if they have difficulties in their social interactions, sometimes teachers can implicitly show some, I won't go as far as to say dislike, but implicit support, and not stepping in as much or as often for that child who may be more vulnerable. So we knew that there were some sort of psychological factors that played a role in bullying, but we also found that even children's genes may predict the likelihood that they will go on to be bullied. What does that mean? Well, what we did is we used data from twins in a bunch of different studies. So in the most simple design, we compare identical twins, nature's clones. They share 100% of their DNA, and we compare them to non-identical twins. They share 50% on average of their non-segregating DNA. And all other things being equal, what we find is that the correlation, the similarity on whether or not a child experiences bullying and how much bullying they experience, it's much more similar in those identical twins compared to the non-identical twins. Now, these are twins who've grown up in the same home, so they're exposed to, broadly speaking, the same parenting, the same socioeconomic background. They probably go to the same school, and more often than not, they went to the same school class. So they're alike. And yet, we're finding the identical twins are closer in resemblance, and that tells us that genes are playing an important role. And you can estimate heritability from these kinds of analysis. So you can compare the identical twins with the non-identical twins, and you can put a number on how much of the differences between people may be attributed to genetics. And it's a pretty high number for victimisation. And that's quite strange. Why should an outside experience be correlated with your genetics? Why should my genes have any kind of correlation with whether or not I'm bullied? That seems quite strange, until you realize that actually any human behavior or experience at some level, there will be a role of genes in there. So I've already told you that having low self-esteem makes you more likely to experience bullying. Low self-esteem has a partly genetic component, only partly. We're not talking about single genes, we're talking about lots of genes with small effects, and they may add together and put you more at risk of being bullied. However, just because someone's genes are correlated with their likelihood of experiencing something, it doesn't mean that it's their fault, certainly not. And it also doesn't mean that this is a static finding that will happen or that will be the case forever. It's not a problem of their genes. And in fact, I would argue that those relationships tell us as much about the social environments our young people are in as it does about someone's genes. So other colleagues have actually tried to look at which genes are correlated with bullying. So in my analysis, we just looked at twins. So we can't say which genes, we can just say that genes are playing a role. But they have looked at which genes. Now, amongst other things, for example, they found that genes that correlate with having a high BMI, high body mass index, so being perhaps overweight, that correlates with your risk of being bullied. So it can only go in that direction because this is your DNA, it's fixed from birth, it's fixed from conception. So if there's a correlation there, it's not that being bullied is causing people to overeat, which was one hypothesis, but rather overweight seems to be associated with bullying. Well, that doesn't mean that we should tell a child to lose weight per se. That's a whole different discussion, a whole different debate. What that tells us is something about the social norms that makes a child with a high BMI be more likely to be bullied. That tells us something about society, something about peer groups and teenagers and who they're targeting. So I would argue, even when we find these genetic associations, they actually tell us as much about the environment as they do about the individual. So similarly, we find young people who have a high polygenic risk score, a genetic risk score for something like ADHD, are more likely to experience bullying at school. And again, that tells us, there may be difficulties in the classroom environment in terms of peer relationships, in terms of emotion regulation, inhibition of behaviour, and so on, that puts that young person at more risk. So whilst It's very complicated. Those risk variables that lead one to being at greater risk of being bullied or not, they are interconnected. They are not fixed. And if anything, they tell us something about the norms we may want to target in our bullying intervention and prevention work. So I think the last thing I wanted to say, it's a bit of a whirlwind tour of all the things that, that might put you at risk of being bullied. What can we do about it? What should we do about it? Well, firstly, I think given that the prevalence of bullying is so high, 30%, that's shockingly high. Given that it's so high, given that we seem to find a robust impact on young people's mental health, we certainly need to be doing more. The good news is that this is a tractable risk factor. This is something we actually can intervene on. Unlike many complicated and difficult things that may play a role in mental health, bullying is something that we already know how to change. There are existing interventions that can target bullying in the school environment, that can reduce the overall prevalence of bullying and hopefully help young people. So our team at the moment, when the schools reopen, are trying to implement the Kiva intervention in schools in and around Oxfordshire as part of a larger study that's also across England and Wales. And the Kiva intervention actually works by changing the whole group norms in a school, by promoting empathy for young people who are more vulnerable to being victimised, and to make sure that when other individuals are present when bullying happens, that they know that they all have a role to play to stop bullying and to promote a better school environment. So it's a whole school anti-bullying intervention. It's called Kiva, so if anyone is interested in finding out more, please do get in touch with me. I would love to tell you more about it, but I think I'm nearly at my allotted time. So I'm going to encourage Professor Dunbar to turn on his camera as well, because I think we're going to ask each other some questions before we open the floor for a discussion with our panelists. Over to you, Robin.
Yes, indeed. So we already have a number of questions I see that have been coming in, which is great. We'll try and get around to getting through as many of those as we can in a few minutes. But I'm just going to start off really by asking Lucy, really, you've not mentioned gender, and in fact I didn't either. But it occurs to me that when we look at the nature of the social world, and in adults, we find very, very different kind of social styles between the two genders. And I really wonder whether that has an impact in sort of children, as it were, and teenagers, in terms of bullying propensity and sort of risk of being bullied in some ways.
Question. So there are certainly some gender differences that we see. So typically boys are more likely to be involved in bullying both as bullies and victims, particularly in younger ages. And then it does seem to change a little bit as they get older. But the type of bullying, there are some, broadly speaking, gender differences. So as you might guess, physical bullying is more common amongst boys than girls. For example, girls are more likely to use sort of social exclusion and social bullying and manipulation. So there's a very interesting discussion at the moment about whether that's a genuine effect or whether it's simply that girls tend to develop faster than boys and maybe are better able or more developmentally able to manipulate other people to gain social reward that way. Because obviously there's probably less consequences from using that kind of manipulation, which may be less well observed by teachers than from using physical altercations. So that's really interesting. One thing I think that interests me, at least in childhood, the impact of bullying doesn't seem to differ between girls and boys. So the impact, I haven't looked in adolescence, I think that would be super interesting. But the impact, broadly speaking, seems to be the same. So it's rather a prevalence and a type. Then there's a whole other discussion about gender norms and gender identity. So anything that makes an individual stand out from the crowd could put them at greater risk of being bullied. I say could because it doesn't have to. It could also be, I think it's when you have this sort of constellation of being different. So that could be in terms of gender norms. That could be a whole range of things. But if you are different, if you don't have support, and if that is a difference that you are aware of, if it affects your self-esteem, that's when you're starting to see much greater vulnerability. So it was a long-winded answer to your question, Robin. But that makes me think as well. So we certainly see that it's quite a complicated story with gender, but I know that you've also found some really interesting gender differences in your contemporary world. But do you think that's something about our current culture and society? Is it, do we see that across cultures? Do we see that historically, or is this something about now?
I'd hesitate to comment on the gender differences that we see, certainly historically, but I guess, you know, there are hints that it's the same. But I mean, I think in terms of at least the general structure of social organizations and social networks, we do see some very nice examples, actually, historically. I mean, we think that from what we see, that these kind of limits on the size of social groups and the way they're structured, your personal social network is really quite a cross-cultural thing. It's not something peculiar to us, but there are some nice historical examples. For example, the Doomsday Book, and remember, you know, this was Willie the Conqueror sort of checking out how much tax he was going to get from his newfound lands. And of course, they weren't really interested in people at all. What they were interested in was plows and cattle and taxable things like that, and houses. But the historians have worked out what village sizes were at the time by looking at the number of houses in each village and figuring out how many people there would be on average in each. And astonishingly, it comes out to almost exactly 150 across the whole of England and Wales. And remarkably, 8 centuries later, in the late 18th century, you know, Doomsday Book is 1087, for heaven's sakes. You know, end of the 1790s, village size in England and Wales, county by county, the average village size is still 150, except in Kent, for some reason, where the average village size was only 100. I guess they must all have been over in Calais at the off licenses, helping themselves or something. But and there's another nice example, actually, that's worth mentioning. It's a very nice study by some economists of grazing associations in the Italian Alps. And it's 8 centuries worth of data going up to the 1860s. So these are the little grazing association, village grazing associations, which determine who can graze how many sheep and goats and stuff where. Despite a more than 10-fold increase in the total size of the population for that particular area, the grazing association average size was 145 right the way across that time. They just split and split and split and made people go start new grazing associations higher up the slopes in the poorer land. I mean, it really does seem to be a serious constraint on the number of people we can have close relationships with. So there you go.
Should we be having smaller schools? We found in one paper that bullying rates were higher in bigger schools.
I've been trying to persuade the educational establishment for a very long time that school sizes are far too big. I mean, I went to the college's school in Brackley, and it was 220 boys when I was there in the 60s. And, you know, it's now 1,500 because they've amalgamated 3 schools into one. And you kind of think, no, you know, this is a recipe for chaos, not a recipe for you know, sort of education and coordination and cooperation. So I, you know, and there were plans afoot. I mean, I noticed a couple of years ago to build some secondary schools that were 5,000 in size, and you go, no, don't do it. It's just the last thing. So yes.
We would end up chatting all day if
yes, I know.
we were able to answer some of these questions. We've got a lot of questions, and we had some that were emailed in earlier today as well. So I shall ask the questions, and we can both jump in if that's okay, Robin, and I will try to get through as many as possible. Robin, what do you think the consequences of lockdown are likely to be on people's social worlds?
I would hazard, I mean, in some senses, I'm not sure we really know. I think for those who are already kind of socially fairly isolated, the impact's quite much less. And I mean, for people like academics who spend all day sitting at a computer and never talk to anybody, the effect is probably going to be zero. And for journalists and people like that who writers in general, if you like, I think what's going to happen for a lot of people is that as soon as we come out of lockdown and we can sort of reconvene social life all over again, what we'll see is a sudden rush of attempts to meet up with family and friends that you haven't been able to see, because we actually see that already. We did an analysis of an enormous mobile phone database, which is about 20% of the entire population of one European country, which wasn't us, I hasten to add. And what we were able to show in there is if somebody hadn't called one of their friends as often as they normally would, the next call to them was significantly longer, as though they were kind of trying to repair the slightly damaged relationship. Why haven't you called me? Are you not my friend anymore kind of syndrome. So it looked as though there was a repair process going on. And I suspect that's what will happen as much as anything. I think there will be probably interesting gender differences. And this kind of goes back to our perception of the differences in the social worlds that the two genders live in. That girls will find this much more stressful than boys. Their friendships at the best of times, grown-ups as well as teenagers, are much more intimate. And for boys, friendships are kind of very here today and gone tomorrow, and out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. So, but they'll be glad to get back to the pub, I'm sure, but, anybody to go with will do. Whereas for girls, these relationships are much more specific.
It will be interesting to see as well what happens in schools, because you're going to, I expect you would have greater anxiety and sort of internalizing symptoms, which is usually a risk factor for bullying. Plus the classes have all changed, so there may be a bit of re-establishing of hierarchies. So I imagine there'll be a little bit of an increase in bullying, but I would expect that would stable out over time.
Yeah, I think these effects will be quite short-lived, actually. I mean, I think both in school and elsewhere, even among adults, there will be a little uncertainty when you kind of meet up with the same people, your old friends again, quite where your relationship actually is now. But that'll pass over and we'll be back to normal. I mean, if lockdown went on for a very long time, more than 6 months perhaps, I think you would see very serious consequences, probably all ages.
Absolutely. I have a question of you. Do the types of friends we have affect the number? For example, 10 nurturing friends, does that mean we need one contrarian or whatever?
That's an interesting question. The answer is yes, because these gradations of friendship which we see as kind of circles, it's almost like the ripples on a pond around you, where the stone is dropped in and you're the stone in the center, and you've got these ripples going out of friendships of different quality. And they do seem to serve very different functions to you. But I think the inner core of 5, give or take 1 or 2 friends, that really matters, that they're good friends. And actually just picking up on a question somebody else asked, actually is these are both friends and family. These numbers are simply a limit on the number of individuals you can have at that relationship. They can be all friends, they can be all family. Typically in Europe, with our low birth rates and small extended family sizes, we have about 50% extended family and 50% friends in our social network of 150. Although interestingly, if you come from a very large extended family, have 40 cousins, which some people do, and people have very often told me this, but we see it in our data, that you have fewer friends, right? Your family come first, and you invest in them first, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who really are going to put everything down and come to your aid, come what may, when you need it. Whereas friends are frightfully fickle.
Pick up that phone, people.
Yes.
So we had one here. This is an interesting question. Why isn't there, or is there, a widely used Facebook equivalent social platform that allows one to fully specify one's own newsfeed algorithm, except for an accepted advertising burden? I don't know who wrote that, but I'm wondering if they read the PNAS study. Did you must know about that one, where they manipulated the newsfeed experiment and found that if you see more negative newsfeed, it would play out on the kinds of posts you write. Or if I want to be more positive, if you have a more positive newsfeed, then that also you're more likely to then write positive comments. So what do you think, Robin?
I think this is the point at which we phone a friend and we ring up Mr. Zuckerberg and ask him what he's doing. This actually just brings up, in some sense, another question that appeared on the Q&A list, which I clocked, and that is really about whether social media like Facebook have actually made any difference. And the short answer is absolutely none at all. We've done national surveys here in Britain. One of the big analysts for Facebook did a trawl of 1 million Facebook pages. And yes, the odd person has, 1,000, even 2,000 friends. Very few people, almost nobody has the full 5,000 Facebook will allow you. But the bulk of people, and by far the biggest bulk of people, have somewhere between about 200 and 300 friends on Facebook. And then a small number, a proportion will be in the sort of 400 to 500 mark. And then the rest is vanishingly small, really. And being as I have no friends on Facebook because I'm not on Facebook. How many friends do you have on Facebook, Lucy?
I closed my Facebook account. I have no idea. But so that speaks to Fleur Hauser's question really nicely. But she also asked, do you think it's made a difference? So you're saying that the number of friendships hasn't, we may have a token number, but it hasn't really changed our actual face-to-face friendships. Is that right?
I think the answer seems to be that most of the friends people have on Facebook are actually people they know offline as well. That's why they keep them going. And what's interesting is we see exactly the same structure to Facebook networks. If we look at the frequency of postings on a Facebook page, they mirror these layers of friendship. They're even the same numbers, they're even the same frequencies of interaction that you would expect to see in the everyday world. So it looks like it's just substitutable. Of course, you have a few sort of extras, people you've met only online, perhaps. But, relatively speaking, that seems to be small. What seems to happen on Facebook is simply you accrete large numbers of voyeurs onto your private world because of Facebook's
voyeurs grooming addiction. That's similar in the bullying world for cyberbullying. So people are really worried about it for lots of good reasons. But a lot of the times it's the same kids that are involved in the face-to-face bullying that are doing it online. And if anything, it just seems to be more likely a new channel for the same old bullying rather than a new phenomenon that people were concerned. That speaks to the negative side as well.
Yes, but at the end of the day, I mean, our impression is that it's just another channel for maintaining contact with people. It was the phone 100 years ago. Now it's digital social media, but it doesn't really seem to have changed the pattern or the quality or quantity of what we do, other than the distance over which we can do it. So it's obviously extremely good for keeping up with friends who've moved far away for whatever reason, or if you're sort of unable to get out of your house, if you're housebound, this is clearly a very valuable social world. So one shouldn't knock it at all. Really, clearly, otherwise I guess it wouldn't be so popular. It wouldn't be so heavily used.
Definitely shouldn't knock it in lockdown. I think that might be keeping many people safe right now. We have a question here that says, is the giving of engaged attention the equivalent of grooming in humans? So you talked about the eye contact. Do you think engaging attention? And I suppose they haven't typed it, but a follow-up would be, does this mean disengaged attention while we're all on our phones and talking? Is that having an impact on our friendships?
The whole essence friendships or relationships, as we've come to understand them from the work we've done, has been precisely that: it's focused interest. And the quality of friendships you have seems to depend on how willing you are, if you like, to be seen to be wanting to invest in that person. So friendship is a two-way process. It's no good me wanting to be your friend, however desperate that may be, when you're already chock-a-block with friends and haven't space to have any more. We've got to both want to make room for each other in what is already a very crowded social world at each of our ends. From that point of view, there has to be that signal that, I'm engaging with you because I find, you interesting and I want to be your friend, and that has to be reciprocated. Otherwise, it's simply not going to work.
You need more attention. I'd just like to add, I'm an academic, Robin. There's always space for you. I have a question here from Tom Nicholson, and for me. So can we be sure of the causative link between experience of bullying and mental health, or is it possible that vulnerability to bullying reflects character traits that are themselves connected to vulnerability to mental health issues? And it's a fab question, and it's pretty much what I spent my PhD looking at, because you are absolutely right in some respects, Tom, that being bullied is a red flag that there may be other issues going on, and disentangling that has been challenging. So meta-analyses where they've pulled all the results together show a reciprocal relationship. So certainly the vulnerability leads to bullying, but the bullying also seems to lead to greater vulnerability. And in fact, that part of the equation, the bullying leading to greater vulnerability, seems to be slightly stronger. So I think there's probably a vicious circle happening over time. And the other part of that, there's been some wonderful twin studies where they look at identical twins where one has been bullied and one hasn't. And they correlate that with mental health outcomes. And the benefit of doing that is you're controlling for all of those shared environmental factors, the family background, the same parents, and you're also sharing for the same genes, because we know genes play a role. And we find that the twin who's been bullied is more likely to display internalizing symptoms. They're also more likely to display a very weird cortisol response when we stress them out in the lab. In fact, their cortisol response, it's a marker of the fight or flight system, actually looks very much like children who've experienced chronic trauma or abuse. It's a very sort of flattened, dysregulated pattern, even amongst these identical twins that only seem to differ between whether or not they've experienced bullying. And we've factored out things about their sort of emotional functioning and behavioural functioning, so that we're fairly confident they're as similar as they can be, and that it's the bullying that's really differentiating them most. So I think it is also a cause of mental health, but the story, as always, is more complicated than that. For me, what it tells me is that our vulnerable youth, we really need to help them. We need to make sure that they are included in our whole school anti-bullying efforts, because they're already vulnerable to poor mental health, and they're more likely to be bullied and to react to bullying. So thank you for your good question.
I'm going to throw another question at you, actually, because it's from my namesake, Ian Dunbar. Ian is my middle name, so he can ask as many questions as he likes.
Well, then, is Ian Dunbar you? Is this you typing questions?
No.
Just checking.
Evidently not. So the question he's asked of you, Lucy, is really about autism and whether that's a risk factor in being bullied.
It absolutely is. And so there are much higher rates of being bullied and higher rates of bullying in special educational needs schools. And the thing that I find really upsetting is that we've done so well at developing interventions for mainstream schools, and really not very well for supporting young children on the autistic spectrum in terms of their risk for being bullied. And there really is an absence of decent quality research. So what we've got is, yes, they're at greater risk, but what we don't have is what might help. My guess is that the bystander type model will still help. So that means, encouraging people to step up and step in, and encouraging empathy and making sure that everyone is on board with an anti-bullying message. But certainly our interventions are going to have to be tailored for schools. I did examine someone's master's thesis, and they were trying to adapt the Kiva intervention, which is the intervention I mentioned, for a special educational needs environment. And it was clearly wrong, because they were using, they felt that the materials were at the cognitive level of older children. So they tried to bring the intervention for older children. But these children were still deeply offended by quite patronizing material. It's perfect for primary schools. It's not what teenagers want to see. So even if their cognitive levels and their reading abilities were, so it wasn't just autism, this was special educational needs, it was a bunch of different conditions, it was just inappropriate for them, and it just didn't work. Plus school sizes, everything was different. So what we need to do really desperately now is to adapt interventions specifically for these more vulnerable groups.
Yeah, I'm picking up, I'm trawling through the questions on the chat line here, and I just one caught my eye, and it's essentially asking whether having fewer friends means they're closer to you. And that's actually quite an interesting question, because obviously, you know, I've been, in particular, been talking in terms of generalities, the average, if you like. On average, we have 150 friends. On average, we have 5 shoulders to cry on friends. But these really are just averages, and there's quite a wide variation between those. And I think it's probably important to be clear about this. So the natural range of variation in total social network size, the total number of friends and family you have, is roughly about 100 to about 250 people. There's a very strong age effect. Younger people tend to, from their early 20s, tend to be at the top end of that. And as you get older, your friends abandon you. You have fewer and fewer, it seems. That's such a robust effect. I'd like to think it's actually selectivity among us older and wiser folk that's going on. But there are also big personality effects, and part of those are to do with extroversion, introversion. This sort of kind of relates back to the autism issue as well, I suspect, because in a slightly left field sort of way, just autistic spectrum people will have fewer friends. I mean, that's simply how it works. But even among normal adults, as it were, you see this very striking difference between extroverts and introverts. And what they seem to do, or the origins of this, is simply a different strategic choice about how to invest in their support network. So extroverts tend to have much larger social networks, and because introverts and extroverts have the same amount of social capital, that's to say emotional capital or time to invest in friendships, they invest less heavily in each one. So they have rather weaker friendships, but they tend to go for quantity over quality, whereas introverts tend to have much smaller networks. They'll tend to be around the 100 size, but invest much more heavily in each of those. So I guess it's a sort of difference between wanting certainty that your friends are really going to be strong friends for you, as against being prepared to take the risk that, you know, they might stand you up when you want to go out for a drink or something like that. So, you know, there is a lot of variability in there, and it does depend on a lot. And of course, it depends on circumstances of life as well. People who are widowed tend to lose a lot of friends, and people who divorce tend to lose a lot of friends because half their friends belong to the other spouse, and those relationships very often aren't kept going, as it were.
Thank you. We have 2 questions that I think sort of go together. One from Rod Parker-Reesa, and it relates to Nicholas Arnold's good question. So Rod Parker-Reesa said, Lucy, have you found any social or structural factors which tend to reduce the prevalence of bullying? So not so much the specific interventions, but more common environments. And to me, that relates to the question by Nicholas, which is that the Oxford student demographic is grossly at variance with that of the general population, and that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that new outsider students at Oxford are bullied by their student peers. Has any work ever been done on it? So speaking to you, Nicholas, I haven't seen any studies of rates of bullying in Oxford. I will say environments where you tend to see higher rates of bullying are strongly hierarchical environments, which there's no doubt that Oxford is. The history of Oxford and everything about Oxford suggests that it's really quite hierarchical, and there's a lot of people. So at a very structural level, you've got hierarchy, you've got people under stress, you've got an age at which young people are much more likely to experience mental health difficulties, and mental health difficulties are one of the precursors to being bullied. And then you've got this arrival on campus at universities where everyone's trying to form new social relationships and establish social hierarchies. So there is a lot of risk factors there. And then there are all sorts of things about the norms and the culture of a place that can support or and make bullying worse. There are a few things that help. So bullying rates tend to decline with age. So they're much higher in childhood than they are in adolescence and adulthood. And so you would expect less bullying in general at universities than you would at school. However, the impact of bullying on a person seems to get worse. So although the overall prevalence goes down, actually the impact of more targeted, prolonged victimisation seems to increase. So for the minority of students who would experience victimisation here, it would, I think there's a very strong chance that this could have a really negative impact. We have fantastic students, we have fantastic fellows, and making sure this bystander model goes all the way through, making sure that people feel confident to speak up and support people is absolutely crucial. And I often say to my students, I think everyone on this call, we might think, oh, I'd never bully someone. I've never been involved in this. This wouldn't happen. But I bet pretty much everyone on this call can remember a moment when something's happened socially in front of them that they were kind of uncomfortable with, didn't really like, felt that they couldn't say anything, and they let it slide. And I've certainly been in that position. And you feel really uncomfortable and you kind of look the other way and you don't really know what to do. It's that kind of discomfort that we need to try to challenge, and we need to provide models where people do feel able to do something and to give a range of options for what that something might be in any particular environment. Where you get a strong hierarchy, it's much more difficult for someone to stand up for someone if they really feel that they're at the bottom of a social hierarchy, and it's, that there will be a social cost to them stepping up. So it's part culture change and it's part we're all in this together. So I hope that addresses both of your questions to a degree. So Dave Morris has also got another question about bullying, but it's probably one that both of us could talk to. Oh, we've nearly gone over time, and I think the president will be waiting. What's the best way of doing this, Robin? So we were supposed to stop at 6. I'm happy to take questions, but should we let the president wrap up and give a summary discussion, and then for anyone that wants to stay on the line, you don't have to, but for anyone that wants to, we could continue answering some of these questions.
Fine by me.
Does that sound okay? So David, can we move over to you for a final talk? Sorry, both Rob and I love to talk. I didn't even realise we'd gone past 6 o'clock.
Sure. Well, I'd like to thank Robin and Lucy very much for this fascinating discussion on a topic of so much interest to everyone, relationships. And I think in college, we're all very envious that you're both researching on a topic that just links to every single person. Not many academics can say that. I think myself, Dunbar's number has been modified for the lockdown. It's become time dependent. For some people, it's been 0 or 1. And now I suppose for most of it, it's up to 6. Perhaps it's temporarily been renamed Boris's number. But we all hope it will rise much higher soon, back to the normal Robin Dunbar's number. And I'd like to thank everyone who's listened in today. We have over 120 people logged in from 11 different countries, including the USA, Canada, Chile, Hong Kong, Austria, Finland, France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, and even the UK. And thank you all for your questions. This is a new way of communicating, and I hope you all agree it's worked really well. I think we should thank Magdalen Rolemont and Anna Norman from the Development Office, who put a lot of work into organising this special event. And this is just the start. We have another Magdalen webinar in a week's time on June the 25th. It's going to be in the morning at 8 a.m. when Professor Robin Cleveland, our Professor of Bioengineering, will talk on the vital COVID research on new ventilators for use in hospitals that's being done in his group. And you can all find information on that in the alumni section on the Magdalen website and can register there again. So we all look forward to seeing you in a week's time. And many thanks again to Robin and Lucy for this fascinating Magdalen webinar today. Thank you.
We're happy to stay on the line if people do want to stay and hear the questions. And I guess, can we see how many people? Otherwise, Robin, you and I can just chat. I'm happy with
that. Yeah.
You are my list.
I'm sure Magdalen or Anna can police that a bit. But I mean, let's say, shall we do another 10 minutes and
yes.
do some more questions?
Anna says there's 93 people still here. Hello, people, and thank you.
There's a question here from Dave Morris. Is there any evidence that bullying has an effect on the cohesion of a social group? And I guess that's becomes particularly important in the context of school communities, really, in particular, obviously, it can also affect work environments, I guess. But
definitely. I'm often asked this. I'm often asked, is it a way of, you know better than I, that evolutionary speaking, having a strong social hierarchy usually promotes better outcomes for a group. And it does in our evolutionary history, but whether that actually plays out. So some people say, is bullying not just a way of establishing those hierarchies and maintaining those hierarchies? What I will say is, so where those hierarchies exist and are violent, you get higher rates of bullying. So domestic violence at home, problems with governance at school, lots of conflict in the neighborhood, then you get higher rates of bullying. And I would say actually those aren't the environments that we want to promote. They don't seem to be beneficial, and certainly in those types of schools, those types of environments, students don't tend to do as well. So not just the cost for individuals who are bullied, but actually at a whole school level, those kinds of environments don't seem to be conducive to the kinds of outcomes we want. So if it did have something beneficial in the past, I think it certainly isn't fitting with our current circumstances. And in fact, quite the opposite seems to be true. But it's an interesting question. Robin, I don't know if you have a view on whether, like, do we see bullying in animals? Does that happen? Probably. Yes, all the time. Everything you see in humans, you see in animals, basically. At that sort of person-to-person interaction level, very much. Yeah. Yes. I mean, well, yes, you're the expert, Lucy. I think we can leave it with you. I pick up on a sort of another question here. It doesn't disappear in front of my eyes. And this is really a question about I suppose it's a reflection on modern times and angst about inappropriate behavior and all that kind of thing between the sexes, and grooming on the internet and in face-to-face world, I suppose, as to whether friendships across the sexes will become increasingly difficult. I've seen that question, or been asked that question many times actually before. It's obviously an issue and a concern. My observation is, I mean, all our data are very, very clear that most people's social networks are very gender specific, and this applies to children as much as it applies to adults right the way through. The figure that keeps coming out of all these studies is 70% of your social network is the same sex as you. And the remaining 30%, which are opposite sex, are obviously perhaps your spouse, but most of them are extended family members. And, you know, it's extraordinary. Also, it's almost as though we live in two completely separate social worlds that occasionally collide with each other, which may explain why they collide rather badly from time to time. We see that in bullying. Bullying tends to happen within sexes much more than between. So it's much more common that girls will bully girls and boys will bully boys. Not, you know, these are broad average claims that we're both making, not to any individual.
I think what these issues do raise, though, is a bit of a problem about the extent to which we use physical contact, physical touch and so on, in our everyday relationships and interactions with each other, because it's very clear that we massively underestimate the importance of physical touch as an indicator of quality of relationship, how somebody actually feels about you. And I've many times said that a touch is worth 1,000 words anytime, because people can say all sorts of things they don't really mean, but the way they touch you tells you, the way they stroke you or pat your arm or whatever it may be, tells you much more about how they really feel about you than anything else. So at one end, and this is just our primate heritage and no more, the sort of that sort of sense of physical grooming, as it were, social grooming, involving stroking and caressing and arms around the shoulder and all that kind of thing, really is important. But it's also clear from other work we've done that, and we've done this cross-culturally, we've done it across the whole of Europe and in Japan, that there are very strict rules, of course, about where people with different relationships to you are allowed to touch you and where you feel comfortable about touching them. And this is why it turns out that we always shake hands politely with strangers, because the only part of the body is the hand that we're willing to allow a stranger to actually touch us. But the closer in, the more of the, literally the more of the body you're allowed to touch, as it were. So,
I was not
expecting
the discussion to go along this route at all, but
yeah.
There's Andy G. This relates to, so you're sort of answering part of his question, but he does say, how can we evaluate the quality of our social relationships? Now, obviously we can do that through touch, but what about them at the moment when we're maintaining a physical distance?
I think it's all about how willing people are to ring you up, email you, Zoom with you. There are all these substitutes that we do. The things that are missing from our everyday life, I think at the moment, and people are clearly substituting somewhat for these in the road, is being able to do these kind of social things like singing together and dancing and the like, and sitting around telling stories. That forms such a key part. And we've always said, on the basis of the research we've done, that if you want to make friends with somebody, the quickest and best and most efficient way of doing it is to sing with them. We always refer to singing in groups as the icebreaker effect, because you can, one of our studies, we actually did this, you can get a complete bunch of strangers who've never met each other before, get them to do an hour's, sort of round the campfire singing together. And when they come out of that, quite literally, they will have been friends for life already. That's how they feel. There's something magic about, well, it's the endorphin kick that's coming out of the singing, the physical efforts of singing, that seems to do it. And the fact that you're doing it in a highly synchronized way. And it's quite extraordinary. And people who are regular singers in choirs, will tell you this, that there is nothing quite so magical as what happens to you at the end of the evening. You're buoyed up and the world is at peace, and it's quite an extraordinary effect. So go sing.
Well, isn't it interesting that that's one of the things that's come out of lockdown? Exactly. It's not just Oxford, that we've been out on the doorstep singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and
yes. Of course, if you're Italians, you do Verdi operas and from your balcony. But yes, just any kind of singing, around the campfire singing, there's nothing like it really for building friendships.
Let's see.
We could probably take one more question. Do you think?
All the pressure. Robin's up next on this one. Robin Cleveland, Professor Cleveland. Can individuals who are bullied reset their propensity to bullying by changing environment, e.g. by changing school or moving to university? Absolutely. That's the good news. So there is only a small minority who continue to be bullied in different settings, it's more likely that you can find your niche and find a new set of friends. Because one of the buffers, one of the protective factors that minimize your risk of being bullied is having close friendships. So every time you move environment, if there's a new opportunity to establish like-minded friends and the perfect number of friends, then your risk of being bullied and being targeted goes down. So that absolutely is an opportunity. I think it's tough for kids when they have to move school because of bullying, and then they enter at a different point in the year, and it's much more challenging to create friendships. But those natural transitions that happen, absolutely, and that is one of the best opportunities, I think, to really redefine your social world.
Yeah, it just reminds me, actually, we've just finished a fairly lengthy study of new undergraduates at a college whose name will be completely anonymous, but it's not Magdalen. So we did 2 complete cohorts, and everybody, each year, the entire freshman cohort signed up to do this very generously. And 2 things I think were very interesting. One was 3 things really. One was how quickly people form friendship groups. And these friendship groups were really strongly characterized by similarity in all sorts of things. This is a very, very widely recognized and strong effect in this friendship area, known as homophily. You know, all your friends are very similar to you on many different psychological and social and other demographic dimensions. That happened, and it didn't really change much. But also what was interesting was how stable those friendship groups then were through the year. And then bearing back on this question, what was much to our surprise, because one of the reasons for sort of looking at it was to look at, you know, here are young folk coming into a strange environment far from home without their conventional support network. You know, did it affect levels of sort of happiness, mental health, and so on? And there was absolutely no effect at all, hardly. Well, there was a tiny effect, but it was almost negligible. So, you know, that particular college is either doing something really good that we should all be emulating, or this is just a sort of reflection of the way friendship groups, as they develop, provide self-supporting environments for the members and actually provide that buffering, which I thought was probably what was going on. And if so, is really quite heartening, I think, you know, that we most of the time we can find solutions to these things, and these solutions are social.
That's a lovely way to end. Oh, apparently there's still 70 people tuned in. Thank you to everyone that stayed to answer. I think there are a few questions, but otherwise we may end up talking all night.
Yes, I think probably.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Oh, Gemma Silbert, who was a previous student of mine, has asked a question. So Gemma, I will email you the answer. I need to let Robin go home or stay at home. That's what you're
Yes. And let Lucy go home.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, thank you very much, everybody, for signing up to the webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. It's not quite the same as being able to throw rotten tomatoes at the speaker and on the stage, as it were. But we hope you all enjoyed it. And I see an inordinate number of names of people I was an undergraduate with here that were signed up. So, yes.
Stay safe and stay well, people. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Good night, everybody. Yeah.
Thanks, Magdalen and Anna.